All right, with that, very welcome Christopher Soghoian on stage.
So I decided to, after the news that's broken in the United States from Apple and Google in the last week, I figured I would change my talk a little bit so that it would be really, really relevant. I mean, some of these slides were made just this morning, much to the panic of the organizers. All right, so I like to start my talks off with a face. I think it's good to tell a story around a person, and this is one of, I think, the most interesting people who has really been at the center of the debate around surveillance in the United States over the last 5 or 10 years. But really what she's going to say, I think, will connect here. This woman's name is Valerie Caproni, and for probably a decade or more, she was the top lawyer at the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was the face of the FBI's legal division, and she repeatedly went before Congress to ask for expanded surveillance powers. For years, the FBI talked about how encryption technology and other security technologies, as they were making their way into the hands of consumers, were undermining the government's ability to catch the bad guys. Just 3 or 4 years ago, the FBI was seeking major new expansion of surveillance powers and seeking the authority to force companies to backdoor their own security. Of course, after Snowden, that sort of fell apart. But I want to read you a couple things that she said, because I think it really sets the tone for this. So this is from 2011 in a congressional testimony. There will always be criminals, terrorists, and spies who use very sophisticated means of communications that create very specific problems for law enforcement. But criminals tend to be somewhat lazy, and a lot of times they will resort to what is easy. So as long as we have a solution that will get us the bulk of our targets, the bulk of criminals, the bulk of terrorists, the bulk of spies, we will be ahead of the game. Right? So when she was testifying before Congress, what she was talking about there, and I think she's right, is that it's one thing for encryption software to be available to the public. It's a very different thing for it to be turned on by default. And what scares the FBI and the NSA and local police in the United States and around the world is the possibility that a dumb criminal goes to the store and buys a laptop and turns it on, and suddenly everything is encrypted. What terrifies them is that without taking any action, suddenly the person who they wish to spy on has the benefit of advanced security technology. That strikes fear into their heart. So, many of us, I suspect, have at one point gone to a smartphone store and surveyed the offerings. I think even for those of us in the security industry, but certainly for our friends and families and loved ones, this experience is one of pain and confusion. You're presented with a bunch of different options, and this device has a bigger screen, and that device has a smaller screen, and all of them have crappy batteries, and you're trying to figure out which features you want more. The companies that provide the telephone service and the companies that sell you the phones, they compete in many areas. They compete in the speed, in the price, in the looks. But up until now, they really haven't competed on security. Right? You walk into the store and you buy the phone either that you think is best or the phone that you can afford. And when you walk out the door, you don't really have any idea as to how secure the device is. But it turns out that this decision when you're in the smartphone store, this decision about whether you buy an Android device, whether you buy an iPhone, whether you buy an Android phone that's made by Google with direct updates from Google, or one of their partners who gets updates through the OEMs, this actually really impacts your security. In many ways, this may be one of the most important security decisions you make, even though for most consumers it is not a knowing security decision. This is not a conscious security decision. This is, do I want to use Safari or Chrome? Do I want to use iTunes or some other service? Right? For many consumers, the choice is really iOS and Android, and realistically, iOS is the luxury product. Right? Apple devices tend to cost more. They tend to be used by people who are more affluent. But the security differences between these products are not salient to consumers. Right? Regular people do not know that there is any security difference between these two platforms, with the exception of sort of the general but probably unproven reputation that Apple has for better security. You know, when I grew up, my mother would never let me buy brand name cereal because she said it was always actually the same. She told me even that the cereals were made in the same factory and just had a different box. And I suspect that for many consumers, particularly less affluent consumers, Android is basically seen as the generic version of iOS, right? What kind of iPhone do you have? Oh, I have the Samsung iPhone. I've heard this phrase enough on the subway in Washington to know that for many consumers now, for many less technical consumers, an iPhone just means a smartphone, and then it's which brand name of iPhone do you have. And they won't realize that there are actually major security differences between these devices. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the story as I'm going to explain how things were until last week, and then things have obviously progressed quite a bit in the past few days. Okay, so Apple has what is probably the most detailed security guide online of any operating system or device manufacturer. And they really go into a significant amount of depth describing the security of the iOS platform, both the software and hardware. The important thing that you need to understand is that there's a place on the processor, there's a section on the processor that does cryptographic operations where keys are generated and stored and never leave the device. This is just a section from their security guide saying each security enclave is provisioned during fabrication with its own unique ID that is not accessible to other parts of the system and is not known to Apple. This is a really important thing, right? So Apple never actually learns some of the information that's kept on the device. And then moreover, when a device starts up, an ephemeral key is created, and then this is used to encrypt data that's stored on the device. All right, so even before last week, there was a major difference between iOS and Android. And that was that Android did not encrypt by default, and iOS did encrypt by default. If you bought an iPhone in the store, you took it home, and you set a PIN number or password, didn't matter how good or bad the PIN number or password was, you had the benefit of disk encryption. You didn't have to take any steps to turn it on. You didn't have to learn about encryption. You didn't have to pick any algorithms. It was just turned on by default. And for some portions of the data that were on the device, particularly the emails, it was encrypted with a key that Apple didn't have access to. In contrast, turning on disk encryption on Android has always been a relatively painful process. You have to go into an obscure area of the system security settings, click a button. It will then complain that you need to use a PIN or password instead of the pattern-based unlock. And then make you wait half an hour or so while it does its thing. Okay, and so for Android then, encryption was a feature that existed. It's existed, I think, for 3 or 4 years or so, but was not turned on by default. Right? And realistically, when security features are an option, but not the default, they're not used by most people. I think many of us in the industry know this. Many of us intuitively understand that regular people do not go looking in the security settings for software. Right? And so what this means then is that the availability of this feature doesn't really benefit most of the users. Most Android device owners are not going to be benefiting from encryption. That means that if they lose their device, their data can be stolen. If their device is seized, their data can be accessed. There's a really interesting book that came out a couple years ago called Nudge, written by 2 lawyers and by a lawyer and an economist, Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, and they talk about the power of default settings. Right? In countries where organ donation is the default, they have higher rates of people who donate their organs. In countries where retirement savings are automatic, where money is taken out of your paycheck by default, people save more money for retirement. Because most of us don't take time to learn about everything, all the possible options. Right? You could spend hours or days or months learning about all the ways to save your money for retirement, but if the default setting is that 10% of your salary is taken out, most people will probably stick with that. Right? And so this book, which has really affected public policymakers in the United States, talks about the importance of responsible default settings. Right? They call the people who make these things choice architects. The person who chooses the default setting has a lot of power. Even though in theory, the average user has the opportunity to change the setting, because so many people stick with the defaults, what it means is that the person who chooses the default, the engineer, or more realistically, the lawyer or business executive telling the engineer what to do, that person shapes the security features that users have, and they shape the experience of the entire product. So the impact of Android not using full disk encryption by default is that it has created this entire industry of companies providing forensics tools, software design, software and hardware that enable law enforcement and in the intelligence community to extract data from our devices. Now, to be clear, these devices also exist for iOS, but the amount of data that they can extract from iPhones is far less. Right? On any given day, if the police arrest someone and take their phone, an Android device is going to reveal far more information than a seized iPhone, simply because security is the default and has been the default on iOS, and security has required user action on Android. For many years, until just actually this past week, if you chose to have some kind of PIN or password on your phone on Android, it actually pushed you towards the pattern-based system. How many of the people in the audience use Android? How many of you, with a show of hands, use the pattern-based system right now? Right, so none of you have disk encryption on your Android devices because it doesn't work with the pattern. Right? This is an audience of IT security specialists. Sorry, it's a shame. Yeah, you also do the same thing? You have the PIN? Okay, you're good. Way to go. Right, and so you know better, but this is the default. The default is so powerful that it pushes you in this direction. And so Google has made the pattern-based system the default. There's not enough entropy in the pattern, and so that pushes you to something that can be broken, but two, to something that is incompatible with disk encryption. The end result is that these companies have sort of been put in a weird situation. So, as I said before, some portion of the iOS operating system is off limits, where it uses a key that has been only known to Apple. But even until last week, there were some portions of the iOS file system that stored data in a form that was accessible to Apple. And so for about 3 or 4 years, Apple has offered a feature where the police could send seized iPhones to the cops. Oh, sorry, the cops could send a seized iPhone to Apple, and then Apple's engineers would decrypt the data on the disk. It's still not entirely clear what the process is. What we speculate it involves is Apple using their own custom bootloader. So iOS devices will only boot software signed with a key that's hard-coded in the device, a key that Apple controls. And what we believe is taking place is that Apple is loading a special boot ROM on these seized phones that then accesses this portion of the disk and copies the data off. Apple insists that they have never provided these keys to the government, that it's only Apple engineers who could do this. But Apple had the ability to extract data from phones, even phones that were encrypted, but as I said, not all of the data on the phones. And this feature was really popular. Apple was apparently inundated with requests by law enforcement. The police in the United States and in other countries were complaining that Apple was taking too long. Apple was complaining that they had too many people asking them for this assistance. But even with this situation, even with Apple being able to turn over some user data, being able to decrypt some of the data stored on the devices, the fact that encryption was enabled by default did present problems for law enforcement, for intelligence communities, for criminals who might steal your phone. And so, Apple has said for some time that they could do this. they said that they could do this. They never really advertised it. It certainly wasn't the kind of thing that if you went to the Apple store, they would tell you, right? You're looking for the phone, and you're saying, oh, do I want the old model or the new one? Do I want the iPad or the iPhone? Oh, by the way, we can turn over your data to law enforcement. Like, this wasn't the kind of thing that the salespeople would advertise. But on their website, in an obscure area, they would say that they had the capability to bypass the security settings. And many people, I think, were uncomfortable with this. Okay, so that was the status quo until last week. Android devices not really encrypting by default. Apple encrypting by default, but only some portions of the phone actually using encryption with a key that Apple didn't have. Then we see an open letter linked to from the homepage of apple.com, an open letter from the CEO talking about the company's commitment to privacy. Right? I think it's probably fair to say that the last year's worth of stories, the Snowden revelations, the Prism slides with Apple's logo were really bad news for the company. And so they made this announcement. They made an announcement in which they said, basically, Apple is going to compete on privacy. We're going to compete with several other companies who were not named but hinted at in the letter. And Apple has decided that it no longer wants to be in the business of surveilling its users, or at least decrypting data on seized phones. This is from the open letter. Unlike our competitors, Google, Apple cannot bypass your password and therefore cannot access this data. So it's not technically feasible for us to respond to the government warrants for the extraction of data from devices in their possession running iOS 8. So Apple said that they had changed the technology in iOS 8 so that instead of only small amounts of data, instead of just the email being encrypted with a key that only the customer had, now a lot more data on the device. Photographs, contacts, other information were now encrypted with a key that was generated on the device and never uploaded to Apple. This led to a lot of press, and then less than 24 hours later, Google responded and said that they too were going to be upgrading the encryption in their smartphone operating system. As of the next version of Android, which should be coming out in a few months, disk encryption will be enabled by default. Right? So Google has learned that defaults matter, and that when you set up a new Android device, it will prompt the user to turn on encryption. This is a big deal. Right? In many ways, it might even be a bigger deal for Android than for Apple. Right? Apple is going from OK encryption to better encryption. Google's going from no encryption to default encryption. It's a pretty big change. To be clear, the Android move probably isn't going to be that much of a problem for law enforcement. Google uses the same PIN number or password for both disk encryption and the unlocking the screen. Right? So you either use a PIN number or password. You're entering this pattern 20, 30, 40 times a day. You're not going to use a 20-character password. It's not going to happen just because of usability. And so as long as Google is using the same PIN number or password for both the screen lock and the encryption, people are probably going to choose very, very weak encryption keys. Okay, so that was the issue of stored encryption or data storage encryption on the device. It's been known for probably a couple of years now that Apple is using some form of end-to-end transport encryption for its iMessage and FaceTime platform, so for real-time text messaging, audio and video. The keys are generated on the device. Apple acts as a certificate authority, and so it seems like the company could be forced to provide different keys for users, but the company insists that they've never received a request like this, and what seems to be the case is that they are not in possession of the user's private keys, and they're not in a position to retain, rather to intercept plain text of communications. In contrast, the real-time text messaging, video, and voice platform that's built into Android, Hangouts, is only encrypted from your device to Google. So if you're having a text communication with your friend, it's encrypted from your phone to Google over SSL, sits there on Google servers in unencrypted form, and then it's then delivered to the other party. Google, since Hangouts first launched, has continually refused to answer questions from journalists and from advocates about whether or not they are able to intercept Hangouts for law enforcement. We don't know. The company refuses to say whether they can, but from a technical position, you could understand how it might be possible to intercept that. And certainly, Apple's FaceTime and iMessage system are definitely more secure. They're not as secure as they could be, and for people who know about the importance of security, systems like TextSecure and Signal that Moxie has made are certainly much, much better. But the power of the defaults, again, wins out, right? Apple has turned on iMessage by default. If you have an iPhone and you send a text message to anyone else with an iPhone, it's automatically encrypted. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to learn about encryption. You don't have to configure keys. It just works. And so, unsurprisingly, we are now seeing law enforcement agencies complain about encryption. We're seeing them complain that they are not able to get data from real-time encrypted services that Apple and other companies are making because millions of messages are sent a day using these services. All right, so that's the encryption that's built into the smartphones, both for storage and for real-time communications. We also have the situation on the desktop or on our laptops. So Apple has offered encryption in macOS for several years. It's not enabled by default, which means that probably most people in the room are not using it. How many people in the room have a Mac? Hands up. How many people in the room are using encryption on their Mac? Hands up. Ooh. Again, the power of defaults. Right? The power of defaults. It only takes one button click, but that's apparently one button click too many for the experts in the room. So 2 passwords. Yeah, yeah, you're right. So Apple requires that you turn on disk encryption for macOS using this button to turn on File Vault. What's important to note is, as of I think 1 or 2 versions ago of macOS, the default setting actually uploads a copy of your private disk encryption key to Apple servers. As you might understand, there are real privacy downsides to giving a company a copy of your private encryption key. On the other hand, if you forget your password, this means that Apple can give you your data back without you losing everything. And this gets to the core of a very difficult balance for companies. Right? And on one hand, they want to offer encryption to their customers. On the other hand, telling people that they're going to lose their data is a really difficult sell, particularly because people forget their passwords all the time. Microsoft has long offered disk encryption. BitLocker is pretty established at this point, but I suspect that unless you're working in a corporate environment, you probably are not using BitLocker. Although, given how few of you are using encryption on Mac OS, I guess that's not surprising. Microsoft sells all these different versions of Windows. There's like 10 different versions of Windows that you can buy. And more importantly, the version of Windows that you get when you buy a new computer in the store, the version of Windows that's sold to regular consumers, not enterprise customers, not educational customers, but the regular people who walk into the store, they get a version of Windows that does not include disk encryption, traditionally. Up until Windows 8, encryption was not included in the operating system, and it was not until 8.1 with certain versions of hardware that disk encryption was turned on by default. Even now that Microsoft has finally started turning on disk encryption by default and including it in the product, they do so with a copy of the private key uploaded to Microsoft servers. So there's no way right now for Microsoft customers to get disk encryption enabled by default without Microsoft also having the keys with which to turn over your data to someone else. Again, so as I described before, you have this situation where for many consumers, computers are all the same. The Apple computer is the luxury computer. The Windows computer is the cheap computer. If a regular consumer walks into the store and is just buying a device with which to browse the web and send emails, the consumer with more money will have access to encryption. They probably won't turn it on, but they'll have access to encryption. And the consumer who's buying the cheapest PC that money can get, the 200 euro Windows laptop, that consumer probably won't get encryption, or at least didn't until Windows 8.1. And again, that's why we have BitLocker. That's why we have TrueCrypt. The fact that this open source project, this project made by an anonymous developer or anonymous developers, has been so popular. The reason that people were so worried when the developers said, okay, shutting down this project is because we were dependent on this software for disk encryption. This has become an essential security component for many people because they didn't have access to BitLocker, because Microsoft wanted you to pay 50 or 100 euros more to upgrade to a more expensive version of Windows. And so to bring it back to the quote that I started with, right? Valerie Caproni, the top FBI official. As long as we have a solution that will get us the bulk of our targets, the bulk of criminals, the bulk of terrorists, the bulk of spies, we'll be ahead of the game. Right? And there are no terrorist laptops. There are no drug dealer cell phones. Right? All the criminals, they use the same hardware as the rest of us. They use the same software as the rest of us. And so if a drug dealer walks into the store and is buying a smartphone, or they walk into a store and they buy a laptop, the fact that traditionally these devices were not using disk encryption by default, that made the job of law enforcement very easy. Right? What it meant was that once they got their hands on the device, extracting the data was a relatively simple task with forensic software made by one of a dozen surveillance companies. But now that these companies, the companies that make our smartphone software, our laptop operating system software, now that these companies are slowly starting to move towards encryption, you can see people in the law enforcement community getting a little bit worried. Right? Suddenly, instead of, oh, I just run this forensic software, now it's, oh, I have to get the target to give me his password. That becomes a little bit more difficult. What I want to also emphasize is that the status quo right now is that the rich get better security than the poor. Right? For many people, Apple devices are not about better security. They're not even about more reliable hardware. They're just about a luxury item. Right? I want to use the product that's nice, the product costs more. Right? When you think of the average Apple customer, they're more likely to be white, they're more likely to be affluent. Right? If you send your children to college or to university and you buy them a new laptop, I suspect many people in the room are going to send them off to university with a MacBook. They probably already even have MacBooks in many cases. But when we think of who is using these Android devices, these 99 euro devices that are prepaid, that never get software updates, right? For many people, Android is the device of the poor. The 200 euro Windows computer, no features, nothing special, right? This is a device of the poor. And so what this means then is that when the more expensive devices include better security features, and they're enabled by default, that creates a system that is completely rigged against the poor. The rich get encryption, the poor get no software updates. The rich get encrypted communications end-to-end. The poor have their text messages going in plain text, stored on a company's servers for days, weeks, months, or even years. And so that's a problem. It's particularly a problem in the United States and in many European countries where the law really has lagged behind, where the government is allowed to search your phone, allowed to search your computer, allowed to save data. Right? They arrest you for one thing, they use the information in a later case months or years later. Okay, so why haven't we had this stuff by default 5 years ago? Why has it taken so long for Apple to turn this on? Why has it taken so long for Google to even make a few small steps in the right direction? So one of the big ones is probably this issue of data loss. Right? For a major company that has hundreds of millions of customers, a company that sells products to the average consumer, disk encryption and encryption of data with a key that's not known to the company is a really tough sell. Right? Many regular people use their computers to store photos of their loved ones. The photos of your child that you've taken throughout their whole life, from the first time they walked, to the first birthday candle that they were blowing out. Like these important moments that can never be regained. And telling a customer, well, we're sorry that you forgot your password, but because of the full disk encryption we're using, you've lost your data. That's not something that any major company can tell regular people. And the fact is that regular people forget their passwords all the time. We don't really know how to build stored encryption services that are resilient to government coercion, but also work when the user forgets their password. Right? If Google can reset your password for you, they can reset your password for the police. And in fact, they do reset passwords for the police all the time. And so we don't know how to fix this problem. The technical community does not know how to do password recovery in a way that is resistant to law enforcement. And many of these companies don't want to deal with angry customers. And where we've seen the Apples of the world move towards more and more encryption, it's for products where data loss is okay. Right? So if the iPhone is backing stuff up to iCloud by default, telling people, oh, you forgot your smartphone password, you have to wipe the device now, that's not a big problem, because you reset the phone, you copy the data from the cloud, you're back in business. But where the encryption keys would destroy data, you're not going to see any big companies going in that direction, because consumers get mad. Right? Consumers do not want to lose their data. All right, the other main problem, of course, is the business model. This is Vint Cerf, one of the creators of TCP/IP, sort of one of the grandfathers of the internet, senior executive at Google. A couple years ago, he was on a panel, and he said this: we couldn't run our system if everything in it were encrypted, because then we wouldn't know which ads to show you. This is a system that was designed around a particular business model. Right? For Gmail to work the way it works right now, they need to scan your email for ads. That's the product that we all get. For those of you who are in the enterprise and who are using Google Apps, you have a different relationship with Google. You pay $50 a year or the local equivalent, and you don't get email ads. Right? Google is scanning your ads for antivirus, for malware, but they're not scanning them for advertising purposes. But for the general public, ads are the business model that's adopted by Google, by Facebook, by Twitter. And so these companies need to have access to our data. That makes end-to-end encryption very, very difficult. Right? They need to see our data to deliver ads to us. And if you see what's happening with Apple, they have a different business model, and I think they're now starting to think that they can compete in privacy in a way that other companies cannot. This is from Tim Cook's open letter last week. Our business model is very straightforward. We sell products. We don't build a profile based around your email content or web browsing habits to sell to advertisers. We don't monetize the information you store on your iPhone or in iCloud. We don't read your email or your messages to get information to market to you. Right? This is Apple saying that they don't need your data because they have your money. And I think it's probably a fair statement, right? Apple doesn't care what you do as long as you buy an overpriced phone every 2 years. And that's probably a more healthy business model. It's probably better that the company make money from us as opposed to making money from advertisers who are getting our data. And so with the usability issues aside, right, leaving aside this question of what happens when people forget their password, companies that make money directly from users are going to find it easier to deploy encryption in their products. It's just simple economics. And then the other main barrier to companies turning on encryption and adding additional security features is this question of government pressure, right? And governments don't want to make life difficult for themselves. They don't want the bad guys or the good guys, because they don't know who the good guys and the bad guys are. They don't want us to all have security technology turned on by default. And so the government, will come to a company and make them an offer they can't refuse. In the movies, the offer looks like this. Horse's head in the bed. But typically what the offer looks like is, a bunch of lawyers showing up at your office with a piece of paper telling you, you must do this. You must turn over your encryption keys. You must give us a back door. You must give us this data. Oh, and by the way, you can never tell your customers. Right? And it's for that reason that Apple's announcement last week was so interesting. Right? The company didn't say, we no longer intend to help the government. That's a very difficult position for a company to take. In the US, and I'm going to simplify things, but the system of laws that we have are such that if a company can do something, they must do something. The debate is about, do the police have to get a judge to sign an order? At which point does the company have to help? But at a certain point, the company has to provide all the help that they can. And so no company can draw a line in the sand and say, we don't want to do that. It's very difficult for them to do that. But if they cannot do that, if the technology prevents them from doing that, then they have a good response. Right? And so what Apple did was they changed how the technology worked. It's not that they don't want to help the government, it's that now the devices are so secure that they're not able to help the government. And so what Apple has basically done is they've tied their own hands. Right? They've given themselves a technical excuse for no longer enabling surveillance. And it's not just US government surveillance. It's assistance to the UK government, to the Swedish government, to the Chinese government, and to the Russian government. Apple devices are sold everywhere in the world, and it seems pretty clear that the company doesn't want to be in the surveillance business anymore. I know this might sound like a cheerleading session for Apple, and I apologize. I have serious concerns with the company's approach to free speech, with the way that they control the devices that they sell to us, the way that they disallow certain kinds of apps that I think people should be able to tether. I think people should be able to download apps from alternate app stores. But what's clear is that Apple is innovating on security. And maybe we're going to get some competition in the market when these multi-billion-dollar companies decide that these security features are a place where they think they can make money and compete. The final area where security becomes tough to roll out is this question of market power. Right? So Apple makes the phone, they make the chips in the phone, or at least they design the chips that go in the phone, and they make the operating system that runs on top of the phone. That makes it very, very easy for them to design security the whole way through. Google doesn't do that. Google makes the operating system, Samsung or LG or HTC make the phones, and then Qualcomm and other companies make the chips. And so Google can only really do software-based security. They're not able to say this, all Android phones must have this hardware, because the companies that make the phones don't want to put crypto accelerating hardware in every phone. That's just not something those companies want to do. It's much more difficult for Google to build something that's secure from the ground up, because they just have far less control over these devices. Okay, so we've come a long way in the past few years. As recently as 2008, 2009, Google was saying that security should be something that users turn on. This was a blog post that Google wrote in 2009 when they first announced the availability of an SSL option for Gmail. They said, SSL can make your mail slower, your computer has to do all this extra work. That's why we leave the choice up to you. In 2009, Google was saying that regular people, consumers, should make the decision about encryption. They should turn on settings if they really want it. By 2010, Google was turning on SSL by default. In 2014, Google is turning on encryption in the device by default. Right? No longer is security being left up to the user. Now, this company that has 300, 400 security engineers, that has smart people working for it, it's making the right decision for users. It's not forcing users to pick and choose and to educate themselves. But we still have a little bit of a way to go. These companies are still not delivering products that are as secure as possible. But the fact that these products are enabled by default, the fact that a consumer now can buy a smartphone that will encrypt their data, both in storage and in transit, is going to make a big difference to not just to the people in this room who apparently don't use encryption, but to the regular people out there too. Thank you very much.
Great.